Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Darrell Driver, and I am the director of the Advanced Strategic Art program here at the Army War College. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We're joined today by Colonel Marcus Antonini. I had to pause because I know him as boss. That's his call sign. Colonel Marcus Antonini just finished a year here at the Army War College where he participated in the Advanced Strategic Arts program for the past year. He's also a member of the Russia-Ukraine Integrated Research Project. Before attending U.S. Army War College, Colonel Antonini was the Deputy Operations Group Commander of the 509th Operations Group at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. Colonel Antonini has also served in various operational staff assignments, including as the Air Force Weapons School B-2 instructor, where he also went on later to command a weapons squadron at the U.S. Air Force Weapons School. He is a U.S. Air Force strategist and a command pilot with more than 2,500 flight hours. Again, I welcome you to the War Room podcast, boss.
Thanks for having me, Darrell. This is going to be great.
Our topic today is strategic autonomy. It's a concept that's been bantered around a lot in transatlantic relations, especially in France. And we had the opportunity to engage with the Institute for Strategic Research at École Militaire precisely on this topic as a part of the Advanced Strategic Art program last month. But before getting into that, I wondered if you might say a few words about your experience here at the Army War College and especially the Advanced Strategic Art program for anyone that might be interested in what that sort of looked like, and especially any future students that might be thinking about what program to participate in.
So first off, I'm an Air Force officer attending an Army School of Strategic Land Power, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I actually learned quite a bit about air power through this experience, so there's something to be gained more than just an Army perspective going through the program. And more so, I think, going through the Advanced Strategic Art program, or ASAP, I learned quite a bit about being a strategic advisor, which is really our goal. I think the Army War College talks about outplacement or future development for the joint officers that attend here, as well as the civilians, that they'll go on to be strategic leaders or strategic advisors to strategic leaders. And this program, specifically ASAP, prepared me for that extremely well. I thought it was a very good composition of talented instructors. So Dr. Dowds, Dr. Driver, and Dr. Prokowski made up a fantastic faculty. And then building the chemistry in the room with about 13 to 14 other students that were focused on those same and aligned goals made that program extremely beneficial to me, as well as fulfilled my intellectual and professional cup throughout the year.
So we started the year back in October with a staff ride to Vicksburg, Mississippi. We traveled to Washington, D.C. in January, but really sort of the capstone of the entire program this last month was a staff ride in Sicily covering Operation Husky and then on to Normandy for Operation Overlord. And we ended up in Paris at École Militaire at the Institute for Strategic Research, where we talked about a series of strategic topics. One of which was this idea of strategic autonomy, which is what we're talking about here today. But I wonder if I might ask you first, just tell us what that is and why it's such a big topic of conversation today.
So I think when we look at the staff rides going through Sicily and then on to Overlord at Normandy, really what we're talking about is building an alliance structure and campaigning together in a World War II context. So there's some aspects of military campaigning, and then there's some aspects of alliance building, alliance formation, and alliance cohesion to go through some military objective to get to a political objective. That's really where we got to this discussion about military alliances and geopolitical aspects. I think that's how we end up in Paris at the very end. So we see an alliance holding together for a common cause through World War II and building basically the foundation of what is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization today, and what happens when that alliance is either fractured, or what happens when that alliance is not cohesive and certain aspects of countries want to be strategically autonomous. So how can we be part of an alliance as well as maintain our national goals by country to be strategically autonomous? So that's how I think we arrived, and how we had a very good backdrop to arrive at the particular topic.
Right. Because there's this trade-off, right? States want to be strategically flexible. They want to be able to act independently when they want to. But if you're a member of alliance, that could be hindered to some degree. By the same token, being a member of alliance can result in greater security. So there's these trade-offs states are really trying to make. And I wonder if you, that's what it is in the abstract. I wonder if you might be able to give us sort of a specific example of what that looks like in practice. What's some practical examples of those kinds of trade-offs?
So I led this group that dealt with strategic autonomy, and so we engaged at the École Militaire with our French counterparts. Really, they presented a French perspective, and we presented an American perspective on this topic, and then met in the middle on where there were some theoretical and abstractions of this. And really, the group, our group, the American perspective, came down with this idea of what strategic autonomy is. And we looked at it as a state's ability to independently determine and pursue its own strategic interests, objectives, and policies. Here's the key aspect, though: without undue influence and dependence on external actors and factors. So really, what were those external actors and factors that we started to play into this? And we called them what we would call power factors. A lot of them would be what you would think: strong military aspects, force projection, their own defense industrial base. In many cases, a lot of the European countries have this, but more so pronounced in France. So that's why I think it was a great venue. In particular, though, one topic that is, I would say, contemporary to now, it would be the nuclear capable aspect. So the French have their own autonomous and independent nuclear force outside of NATO, and the U.S. has obviously its own independent nuclear force outside of NATO and inside of NATO. So those were some strong power factors for hard power. And then some soft power aspects, so technology advantage, economic independence, energy security, and then those result in some sort of diplomatic influence and information advantage. I think if our group decided if a nation could harness all of those together, they probably had the factors that would make them strategically autonomous. So therefore, they're acting independently without the undue influence and dependence of external actors. But there is a trade-off. So what we really looked at here is, as countries march on this road towards strategic autonomy, if those factors start to decrease, they're losing some strategic autonomy if they want to maintain that level, because they're going to trade that in for, they trade some of their independence in to balance the equation. So they'll get dependence from others, such as the alliances that you're talking about. So I look at it as a balancing act between strategic autonomy and dependence. And as the power factors decrease, dependence increases. And that gives the ability to push interests and influence in the region or globally.
Right. And does downward pressure on defense budgets lead to greater interdependencies between allies? Can that be a way of accounting for this kind of pressure when it comes to defense spending? Because it seems to me true strategic autonomy would be really expensive, right?
I think it is largely, and so burden sharing across specifically military aspects of this. So as you mentioned with defense spending, like NATO's 2%, I think that is a key aspect of trying very hard to spread that across the alliance, as opposed to taking it all largely on as the U.S. has in the past, which is leading to some tensions within the alliance itself right now.
So I think our listeners might actually appreciate a specific example. So I'll offer one and then sort of get your response to it. So you're a bomber pilot, right? You come from that community. Say the alliance wants to develop more bombers and more air-to-air refuelers, right? The United States doesn't want to pay for both, so the United States pays for bombers and France pays for the air-to-air refuelers. That is greater security for both France and the United States, but it's also less flexibility for both France and the United States because now we rely on each other. Now, that's an extreme example, but we can find smaller ones that are actually, at play right now in this kind of balance. Is that a fair example?
I think it's a fair example, and I previously worked at U.S. European Command running Bomber Task Force, and that was one of the key aspects was we have the bombers, we need more tankers in Europe. So there's a European defense cooperation that looks at building up a tanker fleet for multinational aspects. So countries as small as Luxembourg contribute to this endeavor and then end up with air refuelers. We ended up building a contract so we can actually capitalize on the use of those air-to-air refuelers for our bombers. However, other countries are not going to invest in large military expenditures such as bombers itself. So that's a great case where it's complementary, but there are some cases where it doesn't work at all in the alliance's interests. It may work specifically in a country's interests.
All right, so if that's where we are right now, why has this become such a topic in European security of late, specifically in France? I should say that it's not as if the United States isn't also interested in this idea. In fact, in U.S. European Command, there's been this idea of convergence for some time now, and how we could better rely on allies and partners in Europe so as to manage our forces more efficiently globally. But in France, it's become a particular source of interest. Why is that the case?
So from a cursory look over European context right now, as far as security goes, I think there's a lot of pieces at play here. One, there's been a lot of discussion about European strategic autonomy. So define what European strategic autonomy is and where does France fit into European strategic autonomy. Really, France is looking at French strategic autonomy. And the power factors we talked about earlier, they have largely a big chunk of the power factors they need, so they need less dependence. And I think this is in the contextual light of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. President Macron has talked differently potentially than others. And I think it's because there's not as much reliance on Russian power, for instance, and energy in this case. And France actually has its own strategic voice, it's an autonomous voice outside of NATO, and it has the power factors to back that up to some extent. So they can be slightly out of tune with what NATO is saying based off of what challenges in the security realm that they perceive themselves. In addition, Europe is largely galvanized, works largely off of consensus within the alliance itself. So I think it creates a friction point if there are countries within NATO that are acting strategically autonomous, or at least talking strategically autonomous, that may be out of tune with the alliance, but they're doing so because it suits their national interests.
Yeah, this idea of a security dilemma, right? So there's this sort of classic idea of a security dilemma that the more power one state builds up, the more it potentially could be a threat to other states, and therefore other states have to build up power, which then creates this reciprocity that goes back and forth in terms of the need to essentially participate in this arms race. But there's also the alliance security dilemma, which is this dilemma between, as we talked about earlier, giving up some level of autonomy in order to get greater security, right? And so that's really what we're talking about here. But I guess the question that I would ask next, is it really even possible for any state to have true strategic autonomy when you consider the scope and scale of some of the security challenges that we face today?
I don't think so. I think the U.S. or some of the hegemons of the world in contemporary times, historical times, contemporary times, have gotten close to strategic autonomy, but that relies on what strategy that nation is actually going to enact in a grand strategic level. So isolationists, can you be strategically autonomous? Yes, but the level of globalization that we have now, the interconnected economies, the fact that Europe is on one landmass and shares borders, multiple borders with other countries, I think that creates a place where countries can't truly act strategically autonomous because there are dependence on others. And so if the power factor is not incredibly high, resulting in a classic security dilemma, as you mentioned, then that leads to more dependence. And if there's more dependence, then you're trading away strategic autonomy, back to kind of our thesis here from our group. And so therefore, I think it's very hard especially for European countries to truly act autonomously.
So you gave us a definition earlier for how your group defines strategic autonomy, and we've been really talking mostly about the sort of military aspects of whether you're able to independently project military power without relying on partners and allies. But are there other non-military aspects to this idea of interdependence and whether one can have strategic flexibility and act autonomously or not?
There are. I think those aspects, as mentioned, were largely economic. Some of them are energy-based. So we look at Germany as an example. For a while there, they were largely reliant on Russian gas and Russian energy. So that creates some degree of dependence upon the Russians as opposed to being truly strategically autonomous. So if a country wants to enact its own interests, well, it's still beholden in some dependence aspect to another. And so these power factors we looked at, again, technology, economic independence, energy security, information advantage is a key in today's digital age and information age. I think those aspects of this make it incredibly challenging for a country to be truly strategically autonomous because these soft power aspects still exist outside of the traditional hard power aspects.
Well, one area that particularly comes to mind is the defense industrial base. And here it seems to be the United States in particular is on the horns of a dilemma, if you will. On the one hand, we being the United States, would love to sell more weapons to Europe. On the other hand, we recognize that Europe also needs a strong defense industrial base. Is that part of what really is driving France's thought in some of this area?
I think France is in a unique position right now, and I'll speak from an aerospace defense industrial base aspect of it. France actually has its own industrial base for aerospace that's quite effective. So Airbus, Dassault, they're working on a 6th generation quote unquote fighter right now. I think those aspects of it make the strong power, hard power aspects of strategic autonomy available to France. However, it's still in competition. So there's economic capitalist aspects of this at play for competition. But at some cases, I think there's more to be gained by maintaining multiple defense industrial base in multiple sectors for diversity. You can still increase competition, but that does provide the alliance. It does provide the global market more opportunities and more flexibility than relying on one. And I think as we've seen with the Ukraine war, the Russo-Ukraine war, that such things as magazine depth and munitions can't go to a single defense contractor or a single country to provide. And so that's really where I see the strength of the alliance. So the Japanese, for instance, are starting to make rounds for the Americans as the Americans are giving rounds to the Ukrainians. And I think we see that in a lot of the German defense industry, the French industry, and there's more fertile ground to be had here that's beyond just munitions. So as an example, I read the other day that the U.S. Air Force is testing a hypersonic missile, and based off of range times in the United States, that's at a premium. So they're actually going to test it in Australia with an Australian ally there to get ahead on the timeline. So I think there's great venues in the defense industrial base increasing, and there's more creative ways to get past some of the challenges that are present.
We've been talking specifically about the Russia threat, and you just mentioned the need for greater defense industrial base depth, especially on munitions, and how one country can't be the sole source solution for those munitions. I'm thinking of other areas of competition, for instance, the long-term challenge that many defense and security experts point to when they point to China and U.S.-Chinese relations. It seems to me that's another area where you're really going to be relying a lot on allies and partners, not just in the military domain, but also across the national instruments of power. Is that a fair statement?
I think it is. And while here at the War College, we do a regional studies program. The regional studies program that I participated in was South Asia. And so looking and canvassing that region and looking at other aspects of how engagement with the U.S. and South Asian countries, particularly India, can be more fruitful in competition against China. And so one of the aspects we looked at was access basing and overflight. So a key alliance aspect or a key partnership aspect that's critical to either competition or actual warfighting that helps set the stage, as well as how do you bandwagon against potentially China inside of the region? Who is going to be aligned with you in certain cases and allow certain things that you need, such as access basing and overflight, or where there are still going to be friction points that you're never going to get past? And where are these countries that India, for example, has a non-alignment strategy? So they're very interested in maintaining some level of autonomy, but how much of that will be aligned with the U.S.? How much of it will be aligned, for instance, with countries like Russia, countries like China, where they still trade but still have friction points? And so I think when we start to look globally, who will be a key ally, who will be a key partner, and what are the key things that we need from those countries as an alliance or as a partnership to get after shared goals and interests?
Yeah, we started this talking about Europe and this idea of how much strategic flexibility you trade away in order to gain the advantages of alliance. But the India example is really a good one because historically, as you pointed out, that they have maintained this non-aligned sort of place in the world between formerly the Soviet bloc in the U.S. and Western allies. Do you think that's changing? Maybe not toward, aligning itself completely with one bloc or the other, but maybe moving toward this idea of strategic autonomy as compared to complete non-alignment, where they maintain flexibility to act in some cases, but nevertheless are in some ways involved with supporting U.S. efforts to maintain the current global liberal world order?
That's a great question. That's a deep question. So I think when we look at that particular topic, what are India's national interests at the time? What is the current administration with the new Modi government in play? How will that change as China enacts some of its policies? So there's certain cases where there's long-standing relationships, such as the Russians and the Indians for supplying energy as well as defense. And those are to the tune of billions of dollars as far as defense spending goes. So to strip out every piece of Russian equipment that was ever sold to India to replace with Western equipment would be significant. And I think long term, so while you can bring people in and align more, there are some things that need to be had from just a capitalist perspective. So cheap energy and cheap weaponry, or we're going to now use Western weaponry, but it's going to take a long time. And there's still maintenance contracts in play with Russia to maintain these vehicles that they purchased years and years ago. So while I think they can be more aligned towards the West, there are still things that we should be cognizant that it is not a cold turkey throw away any relationship with other countries because of the global interactions. And we have to see really, I think, within the region what China does. So the line of actual control on India's northern border, there's still a tension point. So how does China play its cards there? They may push India more towards Western alignment, or relationships may cool, which may keep India right where it wants to be as non-aligned and strategically autonomous in the particular region if there aren't tensions flaring. So I think time will tell for something as deep, but we have to look historically back to where are these relationships, who are these long-standing partners and allies in the region, and what is the U.S.'s long-standing relationship in the region. And those relationships take time to mend or to pivot towards alignment contextually to something that is acute.
So there are other allies and partners in the region that we could sort of employ this concept of strategic autonomy to understand those relationships. I'm thinking primarily about some people's argument that there needs to be something like a NATO in East Asia, or some maybe hub and spoke system. Is anything else out there that you find relevant to this idea?
So I think ASEAN is the easy answer that people go back to from an economic aspect of this. But I think when we start looking at political objectives and political alignment, national interests, it can't all be based off of economics, because we, as the U.S. particularly, are not part of Asia or ASEAN, and not in the Asian continent as a nation state that lives there and has to do trade with these other countries for national security as well as for national survival. So I think it all can't be economic, but I think there are good steps being made in the region, specifically the Quad. I think that is a great framework for some movement towards alignment, but I do think that there are escalatory reactions potentially from the People's Republic of China for a formalized defense alliance similar to NATO within the region, me personally. But there are some long-standing alliance structures that are still resident within Asia. So Thailand, the Philippines, AUKUS, those all still exist. Japan, South Korea, those all still exist, but how do we get to something a little bit more meaningful for these other countries, specifically in South Asia, to bring them into something potentially formal while respecting things such as non-alignment or their own strategic autonomy? I think that's going to be a diplomatic challenge, but something that is fertile ground in the future.
So we've kind of covered the globe here in about 20 or 25 minutes, but I kind of do want to bring it back to Europe and kind of where we started, because we started with this idea that, at least it goes back as far as the Saint-Malo agreement with between the French and the British in terms of charting a way of talking about a European defense policy that had some autonomy, but without actually declaring to the United States that it wanted to be completely independent, right? And so I think what we've seen as we've talked about these different relationships around the world is that to some degree, every state is making these trade-offs constantly. And how much security is it willing to try to get from alliance structures or partnership structures, and at the same time realizing that limits some strategic flexibility. So having kind of tried to put that kind of wrap up to our conversation here, is there anything that you would like to offer in terms of the thinking about strategic autonomy in Europe and the role of allies and partners in dealing with the threats, particularly the acute challenge that Russia now poses with its war in Ukraine, and the long-term potential challenge of competition between the United States and China? How should we think about the role of Europe along these lines?
So I think it's a great point, specifically with Europe, as we talked about a little bit earlier. What is European strategic autonomy? Who are the Europeans? Are they only within NATO? Are they all countries in Europe? What formal structure would house that? And then how would Europe act in consensus as a European strategic autonomous voice, vice independent nations having strategic autonomy? If we go back to the thesis that we presented earlier, yes, Europe has all of the power factors it needs to be strategically autonomous. However, not all countries in Europe can be truly strategically autonomous given their lack of these particular power factors. So I think countries may say that they're strategically autonomous, potentially act in some ways like they are strategically autonomous, but may lack the independence and the lack of dependence on influence of others that shape actually where they actually go. And so I think that's a particular challenge. And if we bring up the nuclear capable case, especially with the acute threat of Russia and nuclear escalation within Russia against Europeans, it's hard for countries outside of NATO because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to actually have that sort of hard power. France is the only one that has its own truly independent nuclear force. And so there are a lot of countries that want to act this way, but potentially cannot. And I think at the same time, once you start aligning and start trading away strategic autonomy for dependence on alliances or formal structures, that creates a little bit of what Glenn Snyder would look at from an alliance theory of potential for entrapment. So if these are not within their best interest, could a country that's part of a formal structure be entrapped into potentially war or some sort of policy that they're not necessarily interested in from a strategically autonomous case?
And if you're not a part of that formal structure, then you're subject to being picked off by whatever aggressor, happens to be the aggressor du jour, if you will. So it is, in fact, this kind of dilemma that Glenn Snyder was talking about. So thank you for bringing that back to us. Well, that about does it for our conversation. I will say thank you again to our guests, Colonel Marcus Boss Antonini, for talking to us today. And congratulations on your recent graduation from the U.S. Army War College and the Advanced Strategic Art Program.
Thanks for having me, Darrell.
And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments on this episode and send us suggestions for future episodes. You can subscribe to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice. And please rate and review this podcast, because that's how we know what you'd like to hear and what sorts of programs we need to bring to you in the future. We look forward to welcoming you again in the future. Until next time, from the War Room, I'm Darrell Driver.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.